Okay, welcome everybody to this year's Toolkit, which is titled Keywords for the Environment. As you know, the Toolkit is a format in the framework of the doctorate program which we have here at the CCA. So we invite scholars for the last couple of years to open their toolboxes to discuss methodological approaches. This time the topical focus is on different concepts on the environment from different disciplinary fields. So we invited 4 scholars coming from architecture history, but also environmental humanities, media studies, and landscape architecture to give presentations on some of the key concepts which are around and discussed, or which we would like to revisit. Today's guest is Ashley Dawson. I'm happy that Ashley is here presenting on that notion of resilience, which is around for a couple of years, and reframing, re-narrating it. Just a brief introduction to Ashley. He's a professor of English at the City University of New York's Graduate Center since 2007, and since 2001 at the College of Staten Island, CUNY. His fields of specialization are cultural studies, environmental humanities, and post-colonial studies. He's author of books on literature and culture, for example, the Routledge Concise History of 20th Century British Literature, or Mongrel Nation, Diasporic Culture, and the Making of Post-Colonial Britain. Also, from 2009 to 2015, Ashley was editor of Social Text Online with different topical dossiers on after Hurricane Sandy, but also after Copenhagen. We invited Ashley since he's been tackling different pressing environmental issues, climate justice, green capitalism, extraction and fossil fuels, species and rising tides. One of his essays, for example, Extreme Extraction, was published in Counterpunch in 2011. Then this year, Ashley published a little book on Extinction, a Radical History, which is out since April. And also presently, he's preparing a publication with Verso titled Extreme City Climate Change and the Urban Future. And as I said today, Ashley is talking about the concept of resilience. So please join me in welcoming Ashley here. Thanks.
To all of you. As Kim mentioned, I have a background in cultural studies, so I'm definitely hopping around in different genres. This project goes into architecture, and particularly landscape architecture, but I haven't presented to architects previously, so I'm really interested to hear your reactions and to engage with all of you. And in particular, it's really great to be talking about a keyword. Raymond Williams was one of my big sort of influences when I was coming up as a student. So it's lovely to be using his technique of doing a kind of genealogy of a particularly important keyword. And my keyword is resilience. So what I'm going to do in the presentation is to explore discourses of resilience as they unfold on the terrain of the extreme city. As Kim mentioned, this is extracted from a book that I'm completing work on that's going to be called Extreme City, if I can convince my publisher to let me keep that title. Let me know if I'm speaking too quickly, or if you can't understand what I'm saying, please, if I need to speak up. So what I'm going to do is begin and conclude with 2 different case studies, each drawn from the Rebuild by Design competition, which was a post-Hurricane Sandy initiative in New York City that was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, in which many of the approaches of contemporary vanguards landscape architecture are explored. As the Rebuild by Design website proclaims, the contest that they produced was, quote, a new way to connect design, funding, and implementation strategies for a more resilient future, marshaling the talent of the world to answer a region's greatest needs. So when you go to the Rebuild by Design website, this is what comes up. You can tell how key the word resilience is to the entire project. Rebuild by Design offers a particularly telling and I think internationally prominent opportunity to explore how recovery was conceptualized in New York after Hurricane Sandy. Moreover, the competition offered fascinating insights into efforts to stormproof the capital of capital. Perhaps most importantly, though, as the quotation which I read a second ago suggests, Rebuild by Design is an example of the prominence of urban design and resilience discourse in contemporary conceptions of urban futurity. In between my two case studies from Rebuild by Design, I am going to offer a genealogy of the concept of resilience, looking at its use by a highly influential biologist and by one of the most prominent economists of the last century, each of whose work transgressed disciplinary boundaries with abandon, but led to some of the key cultural, economic, and political contradictions of the present. So I'll start out now with case study number 1, the Big U. But before I launch into the Big U, I want to give you a tiny bit of background about Rebuild by Design. It was a competition that was started with seed money from the Rockefeller Foundation, whose president, Judith Rodin, recently authored a book that was called The Resilience Dividend. Accordingly, Rebuild by Design prominently billed itself as a new way to connect design, funding, and implementation strategies for a more resilient future. One of the primary institutional novelties of Rebuild by Design lies in this leveraging of Rockefeller money, funds that were used to kickstart a process of collaborative research, design, and jury-based awards for projects intended to make the New York region more resilient in the aftermath of Sandy. And I actually went with one of the teams to Staten Island that was doing research with local communities who had been affected by the hurricane to try and determine what their needs were in building resilience. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Design in turn bankrolled the 6 competition-winning projects. So this collaboration between public and private entities was particularly lauded for beginning to shift the federal government's focus from post-disaster emergency aid to disaster prevention. FEMA is famously known for sort of coming in after everything gets wrecked and trying to help people pick up the pieces rather than for helping them evade destruction in the first place. Rebuild by Design thus helped move the federal government from a purely reactive stance in which funds are typically allocated only after disasters take place to repair damage done, to the creation of a future-oriented stormproofing network. As the Rockefeller Foundation website proclaims, Rebuild by Design was notable for, quote, innovating how federal dollars are spent and how U.S. communities rebuild after disasters, close quote. So the competition resulted, as I already said, in 6 award-winning finalists who received a total of $930 million from HUD. Bjarke Ingels' firm was appropriately the biggest winner in economic terms for its proposal for the Big U, a plan for a 10-mile-long bridging berm to defend low-lying land at the southern tip of Manhattan from storm surges and rising seas. BIG's proposal was driven by recognition that flood protection infrastructure would only actually be used by the city for a tiny percentage of time. The rest of the time, BIG argued in their proposal, such infrastructure should actively promote New Yorkers' connection to the waterfront, undoing some of the alienating impacts of mega engineering projects of the Robert Moses era, such as FDR Drive, which cuts Manhattan off from the East River. Engineered around the perception that, quote, each flood threat needs to be countered by a particular geometry, the Big U is made up of a series of different units that connect along its 10-mile course from West 57th Street, in Midtown, south to Battery Park and the southern tip of Manhattan, and then back up the east side to East 42nd Street. In the Lower East Side, the Big U is made up of landscape bridges that connect the traditionally working class but now heavily gentrifying neighborhood to a new East River Park built atop Big's protective berm. So here's an image which gives you a sense of a bit of the extent of the Big U. And here's one of the parks built atop a protective berm. Further south, east of Chinatown, Big proposed a series of giant steel panels that would nestle underneath the FDR Drive, creating space for skate parks and Tai Chi platforms and flipping down to protect against occasional storm surges. In Battery Park, the Big U morphs into a series of landscape berms and a reverse aquarium through which visitors can view the passing aquatic wildlife of the New York harbor. That might sound like a joke, but actually the harbor has been coming back quite a lot, and there are some fish and other animals that can be found in the harbor. The Big U was clearly shaped by the forcefully articulated needs of all too often marginalized community groups in areas such as Chinatown and the Lower East Side for accessible urban amenities. But it also taps into the burgeoning tourist industry through its invocation of the wildly successful High Line in an extremely canny manner. Ingalls jokes about the Big U's other name being the Dry Line. The limits of the Big U are surprisingly apparent, though, when one looks at its projected extent. Even if the entire Big U gets constructed as currently proposed, it is built to a fixed height of 16 feet based on projected sea level rise to the year 2050. But what happens after 2050? And in addition, what happens if sea levels rise faster than currently projected? A very real possibility given the constantly escalating amount of ice melt coming in from measurements in Greenland and Antarctica. As sea levels rise, ever smaller storms can overtop barriers built for much lower seas. Consequently, climate scientist Klaus Jakob has observed that the Big U is an example of an intervention that actually increases risk rather than diminishing it, at least if one looks on a longer time scale, one that goes beyond the next 20 or 30 years. As is true of New Orleans levees, such barriers actually magnify danger by providing a false sense of security, leading people to build up risk in fundamentally unsustainable sites. But the Big U doesn't just displace danger into the future, it also displaces it onto other physical locations. Berms, such as those that form the backdrop for the Big U, are famously problematic in that they keep some communities dry while displacing water to surrounding communities. And this is something that actually happened in New York during Hurricane Sandy in the Rockaways, a community, the waterfront in Queens. A new development had just gone up with stormproofing walls that barricaded it off, and the storm waters flowed around the walls and into surrounding predominantly African-American low-income communities, submerging those communities. So these are really very live political issues in New York at the moment. Where will the water that the Big U turns go aside? It is likely to end up in adjacent communities with large populations, particularly populations that are predominantly people of color, such as Red Hook, where Hurricane Sandy hit public housing particularly badly. Red Hook has some of the first public housing developments in New York City, and still some of the biggest. Interestingly, Big looked at flood defenses for Red Hook in their research, but this was not part of their final proposal. It should not be particularly surprising that defense of Wall Street garnered more attention and funding than defense of a historically poor, if rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods such as Red Hook. If exposure and vulnerability to anthropogenic climate disruption in global cities is combined but uneven, so-called natural disasters are not catastrophes that strike otherwise intact and egalitarian cities. Cities are heterogeneous and unequal, which is why it makes little sense to talk about building urban resilience in general. Faced with such universalizing discourses, it is wise to ask whose resilience we are talking about. The storms of the future will affect urban communities, some of which may be resilient due to their access to financial and social capital, but many of which are already riven by slow-moving chronic crises linked to poverty, low and precarious employment, and a lack of access to basic resources such as transportation, healthcare, and education. And again, these issues came up very strongly during Hurricane Sandy in New York, and of course were revealed glaringly to the whole world with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. Another problem with the Big U derives from the fact that the storm surges of the future will certainly not stop in their tracks at 42nd Street, where the berm will end. During Hurricane Sandy, for example, high waters traveled all the way to the town of Beacon, which is 65 miles up the Hudson River from Manhattan. If the Big U protects communities in the southern tip of Manhattan, where, not coincidentally, the financial industry is located, what will happen to low-lying communities to the north? Much of the highly valuable real estate of Midtown Manhattan, most notably the long-postponed but now barreling forward Hudson Yards development, lies just south of 42nd Street. A major portion of Hudson Yards' 26-acre footprint is within the 100-year floodplain. This is an image of the yards, which it's called the Hudson Yards because they're rail yards. You can see there. The train's actually parked, and of course that's below the level of the Hudson. Developers claim that the platform that's being built over the rail yards, on which many of the buildings of the development will be constructed, puts the first floor of many luxury high-rises well above the floodplain, but of course this is the floodplain as it is presently constituted. By the time the buildings are completed and occupied, the floodplain and storm surges that reach it is likely to be somewhat higher, and of course in a generation's time significantly higher. In addition, some of the first buildings to go up in the project are not built on the platform. While some of the new luxury housing may have essential infrastructure placed on higher floors, these new buildings will push flood waters towards older, less well-defended buildings, which tend to be occupied by lower-income residents. So we see the same problem here just north of where the berm ends, as we see potentially at the very bottom of Manhattan. Further north in Harlem, let me give you a couple of other images of the Hudson Yards and the development that's going up there. You can see it's really very, very significant. Further north in Harlem, the threat of flooding is even more grave. This is an engineer's projection of what's happening in West Harlem. Harlem has long suffered from environmental injustice. The neighborhood has a long history of neglect in terms of the provision of open spaces and parks that stretches all the way back to the mid-century era of Robert Moses, who devoted his energies to beautifying the predominantly white Upper West Side through initiatives such as the creation of Riverside Park, while basically ignoring the needs of African-American residents of Harlem. In subsequent decades, some of the city's most toxic facilities, from bus depots to incinerators, were sited in Harlem. As a result, the area has had some of the highest rates of childhood asthma in the city. In the late 1980s, the residents of Harlem rose up against the noxious fumes emitted by the North River Sewage Treatment Plant, which processes wastewater for most of the west side of Manhattan from Greenwich Village all the way up to Inwood, on the very northern tip of Manhattan. Located on the Hudson from 137th to 145th Streets, the North River facility spewed dangerous fumes into Harlem, leading to dramatic public protests and a successful lawsuit forcing the city's Department of Environmental Protection to reduce odors from the plant. And the organization that pushed these initiatives, it's called We Act, is still one of the most important environmental justice organizations in New York City. If you've ever taken the 1 train to the Upper West Side, from the Upper West Side to 125th Street, you know that Harlem faces serious flood threats. The train roars out of an underground tunnel around 120th Street and zooms across a rickety steel trestle bridge before stopping at the 125th Street station, located about 50 perilous feet in the air above the Manhattan Valley. A few blocks west is the Hudson River. It is in this exact area that Columbia University is building a massive new campus. After winning the right to displace property owners in the area using eminent domain, Columbia plans, and Columbia, I think, is the third largest real estate owner in the city of New York, so it has a lot of weight when it wants to throw it around. After winning the right to displace people, Columbia plans not just to put up many tall buildings in the area that is calling Manhattanville, but also to build the largest underground complex in the city. This 80 feet deep basement will stretch for 17 blocks and will extend to only a few hundred feet from the banks of the Hudson. The environmental impact statement released by Columbia in 2007 dismissed the threat of flooding using FEMA flood maps, last updated in 1983. These are the maps that famously did not predict all of the flooding that took place in New York City during Hurricane Sandy, so that's what they used to ensure everyone that these future projects are going to be hunky-dory. According to the general project plan that Columbia issued for the Manhattanville development, the basement facility will house, quote, centralized energy plants to provide heating, ventilation, and cooling and other mechanical facilities, as well as a bus depot for the city. In addition, according to the Coalition to Preserve Communities white paper on the projected facility, the underground complex will also house a biomedical research 3 laboratory that would allow Columbia to snag billions of dollars of federal funding for biodefense and biomedical projects. Columbia already houses the Northeast Regional Center of Excellence for Biodefense and Emerging Infectious Diseases, but stands to earn far more money from the Department of Homeland Security if it can establish a biosafety level 3 facility, which would work with toxins such as typhoid fever, West Nile virus, avian flu, the plague, malaria, influenza, and anthrax. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Columbia has refused to disclose information about these potential facilities, but has a poor record in handling toxins. For example, in 2002, the EPA fined the university nearly $1 million for violations of safety protocols in the disposal of toxic waste. Although biosafety level 3 facilities are protected with very tight security, such measures, of course, would do nothing to stop the advancing tides in the event of a serious flood in the Harlem Valley. Okay, so that's case study number 1. Let me give you a couple of other images of Manhattanville and the Columbia development. So that's the elevated subway line that I mentioned. And that's an architectural rendering of what it's going to look like in theory. Okay, so now to turn to a genealogy of resilience. The same year that HUD launched the Rebuild by Design program, the Department of Homeland Security announced $20 million of funding for a new center of excellence on critical infrastructure resilience. That's what it's called, Center of Excellence on Critical Infrastructure Resilience, to be housed at the University of Illinois. A bevy of resilience-related centers have since been created by the Department of Homeland Security, including one devoted to coastal resilience, and another focused on food protection and defense. In tandem with these resilience-related initiatives, the Rockefeller Foundation created a managing director position focused explicitly on resilience and launched its 100 Resilient Cities initiative. In 2014, the foundation's president, Judith Rodin, published the book that I already mentioned, The Resilience Dividend, whose subtitle is Being Strong in a World Where Things Go Wrong. Adding to the din of resilience discourse, the World Bank launched its Resilient Cities program under the aegis of its Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, emphasizing the need to fold adaptation in the face of climate change-induced disasters into the bank's global development programs. These developments, which span the U.S. federal government, the philanthropic foundation sector, and international financial institutions, are testimony, I think, to the centrality of resilience in global strategies of governance today. Resilience has become a key discursive trope that weaves together a breathtaking variety of sectors, including urban infrastructure, disaster preparedness, high finance, national defense, and efforts to check terrorism of all varieties. Part of the power of the term resilience certainly lies in the sheen of hope that it provides. Indeed, resilience and the adaptive measures to which it refers offer a welcome respite for many policymakers, in fact, for much of the public, from the intractable and calamitous paralysis surrounding international efforts to promote meaningful mitigation measures. In addition, resilience is no doubt attractive because of the many meanings that can be attached to the term, a conceptual fuzziness that allows people and institutions with very different agendas to embrace superficially similar ends. The vagueness of the term can thus paper over political differences, creating common ground between entities with otherwise inimical interests. But without a doubt, the vogue for resilience is most importantly anchored in the ease with which the concept dovetails with dominant neoliberal discourses concerning the role of the state in hazardous times. Deriving from the biological sciences, resilience tends to imply that there are certain inherent properties of an organism, an ecosystem, a society, or any other complex system that strengthen its ability to bounce back in response to adverse conditions. While it is clearly in everyone's interest to prepare for the disruptions that anthropogenic climate change is unleashing upon the world, resilience shapes such preparatory efforts in ways that are sometimes subtle and sometimes quite glaringly apparent, by obscuring the political roots of contemporary social risk and disaster. Or at least that's what I want to argue. Given the centrality of resilience discourse across a variety of sectors, including architecture, it is worth engaging in a genealogy of the concept. The ecologist C.S. Holling coined the term during the 1970s as part of his critique of dominant models of resource management, which assumed system equilibrium over time. That's where the idea of sustainability comes from, of course. Holling felt that such models ignored the complex interdependencies of ecosystems, which, when pressed by intensive methods of agriculture and resource management, could become increasingly fragile and collapse unexpectedly. Researchers like Holling were at the time interested in finding ways to sustain yield rates from ecosystems experiencing conditions of extreme instability. As a result, he emphasized the limits of predictive knowledge in relation to such ecosystems and sought to find ways to magnify the ability of ecosystems to endure unexpected and often extreme forms of turbulence. Holling's work on resilience unfolded in tandem, and it's quite uncanny, in fact, the kind of links here, with that of neoliberal godfather Friedrich von Hayek, who was developing an analysis of economic markets as competitive, complex, adaptive systems at roughly the same time as Holling was working on ecosystems management. Like Holling, Hayek emphasized the limits to predictive knowledge concerning the economy, arguing that it was ultimately impossible for central planners to control or even to predict the gyrations of the market effectively. In his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, called The Pretense of Knowledge from 1974, Hayek argued that public expectations concerning the ability of science to analyze and then mold society were vastly exaggerated, partially as a result of the magnitude of achievement in the natural sciences during the modern period. Deep knowledge of society, Hayek argued, tends to dampen rather than stimulate aspirations for improvement. So in other words, he was contrasting the advances in the natural sciences with social sciences, including economics, which is really a social science, although of course it purports to be objective and mathematical and exact. Hayek was not of that camp. So he argued that deep knowledge tends to dampen rather than stimulate aspirations for improvement. Yet the public is so hungry for hope that they're willing to believe virtually any flim-flam pronounced in the name of expert knowledge. While this might sound like a resounding challenge to the pretenses of today's neoliberal economic gurus, who prescribe repeated rounds of austerity despite the evident catastrophic failure of such policies, right? Every time we have an economic crisis, the solution is just more austerity, the idea being, oh, well, you didn't quite implement it rigorously enough, right? Complete unwillingness to accept that the model is flawed in most cases. So while Hayek's idea of the limits to knowledge might sound like a critique of this kind of hubris, when he delivered his speech in 1974, he had the efforts of Keynesian state regulators squarely in his sights. Moreover, his animus against any efforts to regulate the market is made quite evident in his glancing reference to the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth report, the publication of which 2 years earlier constituted a severe challenge to capitalism's growth imperative. This is one of the classic texts of kind of ecological shock and fear in the 1970s, was the Limits to Growth report. In what would become a form of total dogma during the coming decades, Hayek derided the idea that capitalism was on a trajectory that would deplete and ultimately destroy vital planetary ecosystems. What a load of garbage, right? How could anybody have ever believed that? For Hayek, such a perspective was the product of, quote, men's fatal striving to control society. So Hayek's resistance to regulatory efforts derived not simply from his critique of the ideas of economic equilibrium upon which advocates of central state planning depended in debates among economists during the first half of the 20th century, but it also hinged on his impressively polymathic research in neurology and from his encounters with organic biologists such as the Austrian Ludwig van Bertalanffy. During his student years in Vienna in the 1920s, Hayek studied contemporary psychology and worked with anatomists who were tracing bundles of nerve fibers in the human brain. In Hayek's book, The Sensory Order, he really was polymathic, and impressively so. In the book, The Sensory Order from 1952, Hayek returned to and synthesized this early research, arguing that what he termed the mind, from sensory impressions to beliefs and plans for future behavior, is an emergent property of the interactions of neurons in the human brain. Emergence, term that Hayek was involved in developing, as it is employed by Hayek, refers to the idea that when certain elements of a system or entity stand in particular relations to one another, the whole that is thereby formed has properties that are not possessed by the constituent elements in isolation. Similar ideas informed the work of biologists whose work shaped Hayek's thinking, such as Bertalanffy, who I already mentioned. For him, biological organisms and systems consist of nested hierarchies of organized parts. In a framework that Bertalanffy terms general systems theory, he argued that these principles applied to all phenomena exhibiting organized complexity. Applying these insights to economics and society, Hayek argued that free markets function analogously to the structured interactions of brain neurons or ecosystems, developing emergent forms of self-organized complexity without the need for any outside intervention. By the time of his Nobel Prize-winning lecture, Hayek was drawing on the work of biologists like Holling, who re-articulated earlier models of ecosystems by incorporating third-wave cybernetics theories concerned with chaos, complexity, and self-organizing systems to challenge models of ecosystem equilibrium. So for Holling, as I already sketched briefly, efforts to conserve threatened ecosystems by eliminating competitors and predators could unwittingly weaken the resilience of the ecosystem as a whole. Adapting these arguments, Hayek held that external interventions, such as Keynesian state-organized demand management, which he argued often pumped money into fundamentally unhealthy and unsustainable economic sectors, had a debilitating long-term effect on economic systems. In Hayek's sweeping equation of the financial, social, and biological spheres, complex systems tend to move spontaneously through periods of perturbation toward greater levels of complexity. The role of the state, then, is not to step aside, as some of Hayek's colleagues of more neoliberal persuasion argued at the time, but rather to radically transform society in accordance with the putatively self-organizing and resilient dynamics of the market. The state should operate, in other words, through diffuse mechanisms that optimize the environmental conditions for social reproduction, rather than through centralized control. As Michel Foucault recognized in his contemporaneous discussion in The Birth of Biopolitics, the forms of neoliberal governmentality Hayek and his acolytes advocated were based on, and this is Foucault, optimization of systems of difference, in which the field is left open to fluctuating processes, in which action is brought to bear on the rules of the game rather than on the players, and finally, in which there is an environmental type of intervention instead of the internal subjugation of individuals, close quote. Today, these arguments, once issued from a minoritarian position critical of the hegemony of Keynesian economic policies, and of course of ecosystem management, have become pivotal elements in now thoroughly dominant regimes of neoliberal governmentality that call for a quote-unquote culture of resilience in which citizens are inculcated into forms of individual responsibility and responsiveness to states of permanent crisis. In the National Strategy for Homeland Security reports of 2002 and 2007, and this is the US National Strategy for Homeland Security, catastrophic events are seen not as symptoms of a failure to predict or prevent crisis, but rather, as in Hayek's work, as evidence of the systemic limits to public management and state planning. The assumptions about the foundational character of disequilibrium that characterize resilience discourse thus become a means to shunt the obligation to cope with risk and crisis onto the backs of vulnerable individuals and communities. Such neoliberal governmentality does not aim to prevent danger or to address its root causes, but rather schools us to forego the idea of security in favor of resilient adaptation to instability. The poor are consequently increasingly left to their own devices, their plight only an issue when they threaten to venture into the walled-off compounds of the affluent. Indeed, in much resilience-oriented work, human populations are an afterthought. At the centers of excellence established by the Department of Homeland Security, which I mentioned earlier, for example, resilience tends to be framed almost exclusively in terms of technocratic solutions involving engineering and information technology. So virtually none of them talk about human resilience. Similar, for good and for ill, whatever that might mean. Similar fundamentally neoliberal assumptions undergird the Rockefeller Foundation's programs to build a resilient planetary urbanism. The very framework of the Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities program is neoliberal, since designation as a resilient city is competitive. Only 100 cities get to be resilient cities, and obviously there are far more than 100 cities around the globe. There's a competition to get that designation, and in fact, hundreds of applicant cities were turned away from the program and its funding schemes. In addition, the program proposes to build resilience through public-private partnerships leveraged by Rockefeller Foundation funds, which bankroll the establishment of a chief resilience officer tasked with drawing up a resilience plan in selected cities. Moreover, most of the so-called platform partners who are intended to give these lone resiliency czars access to resources necessary for building resilience are, in fact, private sector entities. Many of the Rockefeller partner organizations specialize in technocratic solutions, such as engineering, information technology, and consulting. And they include familiar names like Microsoft and Cisco, as well as less well-known corporations like Palantir, which is a data mining firm with roots in the homeland security and financial sectors. And then there's also Sandia National Laboratories, an arm of the US military-industrial complex that specializes in nuclear technology, and Veolia, a French transnational company that has played a key role in privatizing water supplies in cities in the global south. Even less evidently malign entities involved in the 100 Resilient Cities program nonetheless carry forward the agenda of shifting risk onto the backs of vulnerable communities. The consulting firm ICF International, for example, is notorious for its role operating the Road Home program following Hurricane Katrina. One of the many politically connected firms offered no-bid contracts after the disaster. ICF had distributed assistance to only 55% of applicants 5 years after Katrina. The remainder were disqualified, denied, or gave up on receiving assistance, and this became one of the big scandals in post-Katrina New Orleans. The recycling of ICF in Rockefeller's 100 Cities initiative is a reminder of how disaster relief efforts organized under the brand of resilience actually work. Despite all of the shiny rhetoric concerning competition and effective service provision, such privatized relief and recovery efforts are chiefly effective at developing inventive new forms of corruption, at lining the pockets of corporate executives and shareholders at the expense of the public in general, and suffering disaster victims in particular. Of course, there are many well-meaning individuals and organizations involved in efforts to build community resilience. And it's a concept that offers, as I mentioned earlier, alluring hope at a moment when catastrophism threatens to numb many into a state of complete despair and disregard. Yet the ideological underpinnings of the concept are all too often obscured, creating a depoliticized context in which individual efforts, no matter how altruistic, may advance rather than challenge destructive forms of neoliberal governance. This is certainly the case in terms of the initiatives advanced by the Rebuild by Design competition, which prefer exciting seeming design initiatives that all too often ignore the broader context of an urban realm structured by neoliberalism. Glaringly absent in talk of resilient cities in general is the most resilient aspect of planetary urban life today, the resilience of strategies of accumulation by dispossession. Indeed, resilience may be seen not simply as a discourse that supports austerity, but as one that actively promotes what the geographer Tom Slater describes as, quote, the territorial stigmatization that so often precedes strategies of dislocation. As Slater reminds us, there's a long history of concepts derived from the biological sciences being imported into urban affairs to incredibly destructive effect on poor communities. Take, for example, the Chicago School of Human Ecology, which drew on then-current biological theories in order to legitimate forms of urban regeneration that broke up and scattered residents of so-called blighted neighborhoods in the mid-20th century. The importation of resilience from ecosystem science, I think, is but the latest instance of such a move, one that obscures the political roots of the global recession and leads to the prescription of public expenditure cuts in cities across the globe in order to restore community resilience. It should not be so surprising that powerful purveyors of urban resilience seldom discuss the ceaseless quest for profits wrung from real estate that drives land grabs and forced evictions around the world. After all, windfall profits are to be made from advising cities how to adapt to the consequences of such policies, as well as to the impact of anthropogenic climate change. To adapt an Upton Sinclair aphorism, it is extremely difficult to get a consultant to see the roots of a problem when his salary depends on not understanding it. Okay, so now I'd like to go through case study number 2. This is Hunts Point Lifelines. And again, this is one of the winning entries into the Rebuild by Design competition. If the big view can be criticized, as I did, for its focus on defending wealthy portions of the city from rising tides, the Hunts Point Lifelines project did at least focus on a site of vulnerability in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods, the South Bronx. But it did so because this neighborhood is home to the city's largest produce, meat, and seafood markets, which together generate over $5 billion in annual revenue. When Hurricane Sandy hit New York, it demonstrated the vulnerability of the Hunts Point Food Distribution Center to flooding, as well as to power and fuel outages. And the level of vulnerability here is really quite shocking. Had Sandy hit 6 hours later than it did, when the Bronx River would have been at high tide, food supplies for 22 million people around the metropolitan region of New York would have been decimated. Protecting these vital infrastructural resources for the city and the region was of prime importance for the design team, and it's certainly an important task. But in addition, designers could not simply ignore calls for social and economic justice articulated by community members in the South Bronx. The proposal for redevelopment of Hunts Point by a team led by Penn Design/Olin, which, as I already said, is entitled Hunts Point Lifelines, consequently acknowledges the interlinked local and regional significance of the square mile of land that is Hunts Point. To gain any traction in the South Bronx, resilience had to be broadly defined to include social and economic benefits to a vulnerable local community, as well as environmental sustainability that would benefit the entire metropolitan region. The architectural and engineering firms who produced the plan consequently strive to present, quote, a formula for a working waterfront, working community, and working ecology that grows out of long-term community plans, close quote. The presentation of Hunts Point Lifelines highlights the fact that the food distribution facility provides over 10,000 direct jobs in what is the poorest congressional district in the United States. Investing in the resilience of Hunts Point would, the design team reasons, provide regional food security, protect living wage jobs, and model authentic community-based action to sustain one of the city's most important working waterfronts. So there are four major components to Hunts Point Lifelines. The first of these is a Levy Lab. Oh, let me just show you Hunts Point. That's an aerial view of Hunts Point. So the first component of Hunts Point Lifelines is a Levy Lab, which is a series of flood protection measures integrated into the South Bronx Greenway, a proposed network of waterfront parks, designated green streets, and bike and pedestrian paths designed to significantly increase access to the Bronx River, improve transportation safety, and reverse environmental degradation. The design plan calls for a series of buoyant floodgates that would accommodate large openings in the levee, permitting the construction of a new pier and restaurants proposed by the Fulton Fish Market. This emphasis on public use is extended in thick sections of the Greenway, where the design team proposes habitat and platforms for recreation on the water, such as an extension of the youth sailing program run by the group Rocking the Boat. The second element of the Hunts Point Lifelines proposal pairs the foregoing design proposals with a promise to engage in local procurement and labor force strategies designed to address high levels of unemployment in the area, while also generating a strong knowledge of waterfront dynamics and popular engagement. This is an element which is entirely missing from most of the other proposals in the competition. The final two elements of the proposal center on major infrastructural transformations. Part 3, which is called Clean Ways, proposes links to public transportation, including a new train station to be built in Hunts Point, as well as a, quote, clean tri-gen power generation station, close quote, designed to, quote, turn waste heat into chilled water in order to cope with the huge thermal load of a district dependent on refrigeration, close quote. According to the design team, this power station would allow the Hunts Point Peninsula to act as a microgrid island when the city grid goes down. The final element of the Penn Design Olin plan calls for Hunts Point to be used as a distribution node and supply stockpile site for an emergency maritime supply chain for the entire East Coast. This element of the proposal builds on the fact that maritime access to disaster-affected sites can often be restored before other modes, and that 15 million people in the New York metropolitan area live within a few miles of navigable waterways, including New York Harbor, the East River, Long Island Sound, and the Hudson, Passaic, and Raritan rivers. So in other words, the proposal is trying to bring back a kind of maritime city, which of course New York once was, but which it's largely ceased to be. Hunts Point Lifelines contains many progressive elements. I hope you've gotten a sense of that from my summary of the projects. And clear evidence of the design team's engagement with local community groups, such as the Point, Sustainable South Bronx, and the Bronx River Alliance, all of which are nationally recognized leaders in environmental education, action, and green job strategies. In order to understand the long-standing struggles of these groups and some of the shortcomings of the Penn Design team plan, Hunts Point needs to be seen as part of the broader industrial zone along the waterfront in the South Bronx. The area is one of only 6 designated significant maritime industrial areas, or SMIAs, in New York City. The SMIA designation is intended to encourage the clustering of heavy industrial and polluting infrastructure. It is no coincidence that all of these SMIAs are located in predominantly low-income communities of color. In 2010, the Waterfront Justice Project of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance discovered not only that all 6 SMIAs are located in storm surge zones, but that the city had not analyzed the cumulative contamination exposure risks associated with clusters of heavy industrial use in such vulnerable locations. After sustained pressure from groups such as the Environmental Justice Alliance, the city agreed to develop a waterfront revitalization program that requires new businesses to develop risk management plans to prevent the release of hazardous substances during flooding and other extreme weather events. Existing businesses, however, are grandfathered out of these requirements. The South Bronx is the largest of New York City's SMIAs and consequently is one of the most contaminated places in the entire city, and that's saying a lot. It is home not just to the low-lying sewage treatment plant mentioned in the Penn Design Olin plan, but also to a fuel depot containing 100 million barrels of home heating oil, 4 out of New York State's 10 natural gas power plants, and over a dozen waste transfer stations where garbage is placed in long-haul trucks. As you may know, most of New York City's garbage used to be transported by barge to Fresh Kills landfill, which is one of the largest landfills on the planet. But shortly before 9/11, Fresh Kills was shut down. So now New York City's waste goes by polluting long-haul trucks to transfer stations and then out of the city to places far afield in the rest of the country. Facilities in the South Bronx handle not just all of the waste produced in the Bronx, but also 23% of the entire city's commercial waste. Along with the Hunts Point Food Distribution Center, these facilities bring over 16,000 trucks every day to the streets of the South Bronx. A 2014 study by the state controller found that the Bronx has the highest asthma death rate in all of New York State, almost 4 times the state average. It should come as no surprise then that community organizations should respond with some skepticism to the Hunts Point Lifelines plan for an additional clean power station. What would be the fuel source for such a power station? One of the people who I interviewed with, Michael Johnson of South Bronx Unite, asked, would it be fossil fuel? If so, wouldn't it contribute to the already massively disproportionate environmental burden borne by residents of the South Bronx? A burden that allows denizens of nearby neighborhoods, such as Manhattan's Upper East Side, which, as you probably know, is a very wealthy area, to enjoy abundant electricity and clean streets and to be able to flush their toilets without problems, while having their pristine riverfront parks and clean air not be fouled by sewage and air contamination. The cogeneration process which the projected power plant is to employ is certainly cleaner than traditional power plants, since it produces not simply electricity, but is also producing useful heating and cooling capacity. And of course, this kind of technology, from what I understand, is kind of cutting edge in the United States. Nonetheless, such a plant needs a fuel source. And there is no discussion in Hunts Point Lifelines of running the new facility using a renewable energy source such as solar power. While the slated Tri-Gen power station would provide additional refrigeration for the Hunts Point market complex, it would exacerbate already chronic pollution in the South Bronx in general. A plan to promote genuine environmental justice would, of course, involve shutting down polluting power plants rather than building new ones. This question of equity figures prominently in community challenges to the Hunts Point Plan's Lifeline in other respects, and particularly in relation to the job creation promises made by Rebuild by Design. Hunts Point Lifelines indicates that job opportunities to be created by the project include, quote, specific construction roles, maintenance, ecological productivity monitoring, as well as private sector growth, close quote. In addition, the design team pledges to use local procurement and labor force strategies. One would expect such prospects to be among the greatest attractions of the redevelopment plan, given the fact that the South Bronx has consistently had the highest unemployment rate in the state and the largest percentage of poor residents in any urban county in the nation. But as Michael Johnson puts it, quote, we've heard these job creation promises before, but where do the jobs come from and how do they affect local unemployment, close quote. Despite the rosy employment picture painted by Hunts Point Lifelines, Johnson said that he and other community members see no guarantee in the plan that any contract that is funded through the project will add local people to the employment roles through apprenticeship programs that train them to take skilled jobs that are on offer. The skepticism here has to do with a long history of businesses moving into the South Bronx SMIA without establishing such training programs and after making rosy promises about the future and about employment. As a result, the industrial development of the peninsula has not trickled down in the form of decent jobs paying a living wage to local residents, as the enduringly high unemployment rate in the area suggests. In reaction, in fact, community organizations have developed their own job training programs. Sustainable South Bronx's Environmental Stewardship Academy, acronym is BEST, is a strong example of such local job creation efforts. But such efforts need to be scaled up as capital flows into the area if the South Bronx is not to see an intensification of historical inequalities. And of course, like the other outlying boroughs surrounding Manhattan, the South Bronx is also coping with rampant gentrification. In response to a wave of real estate speculation that threatens the area with hyper-gentrification and mass displacement, South Bronx Unite has developed a set of principles for private development. These principles specify exactly the policies notably lacking in Hunts Point Lifelines. Among the demands articulated by South Bronx Unite are, first of all, that all real estate development construction opportunities should be given to unionized workers, with preference to South Bronx residents, and with a significant percent to be given through apprenticeship programs to South Bronx residents of color in all building trades. Second, a significant percent of any new residential rental and for sale development should be set aside for local residents at an affordability rate based on the current average median income of the South Bronx. 3, developers should analyze the health impacts of their projects and use best practices to guide their design process to create spaces that promote health. And 4, all real estate developers must support community-designed and driven waterfront redevelopment plans, as well as the reduction of the 850-acre South Bronx SMIA. South Bronx Unite's principles for private development, I think, offer a series of specific and relatively easy to implement policies that would go some way toward addressing the history of combined and uneven development that marks the South Bronx. It is lamentable that such concrete demands for social and environmental justice were not included in the Hunts Point Lifelines plan. Finally, South Bronx residents questioned the geographical limits of the Hunts Point Lifelines plan. By focusing exclusively on the Hunts Point Peninsula, the design proposal excludes neighboring communities such as Mott Haven and Port Morris that are part of the South Bronx SMIA, neighborhoods that bear an equal brunt of multiple life-threatening pollutants. 90,000 people in these neighboring areas are excluded from the Rebuild by Design plan, left with the potential of being inundated and unable to get to the food markets located less than half a mile away. And that gives you a sense of the area of the SMIA. According to South Bronx Unite's Michael Johnson, many meetings were held with the Penn Design Olin team in which community members urged the team to protect the entire peninsula rather than Hunts Point alone. South Bronx Unite even spearheaded the creation of an autonomous sustainability plan, the Mott Haven Port Morris Waterfront Plan. These demands for inclusion were not incorporated in Hunts Point Lifelines, although the communities of the South Bronx have been promised that there will be a second phase to the redevelopment project that will ultimately extend greening and flood protection measures to the rest of the peninsula. For now, however, the profits generated by the Hunts Point food distribution complex clearly are the most important priority in the award-winning design. It is not clear when or even if phase 2 of the project will be implemented. While community members such as Michael Johnson say that they understand the need to secure the city's food supply, they see this prioritization of Hunts Point over neighboring communities as part of a long history of environmental justice. that has affected the South Bronx more than any other area of the city. As Johnson puts it, history has not shown that capitalism protects poor people. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley, for this really rich, dense reading of resilience through two different case studies, and also your rather critical genealogy of resilience as an intellectual project. And I just want to say we have two mics here, and I will open the discussion first to questions and also for an engagement, because like complex notion of resilience, which is in your case taking place at this liminal space of the waterfront with regard to multi-layered urban geography, encompassing food security, health issues, but much more. So are there any questions directly relating to Ashley's presentation?
I hope you're all not too depressed and sort of stunned by how relentlessly depressing and dour my presentation was. I tried to talk about the attractiveness of the projects, but then also offer a critique of them. So, and of the idea of resilience, which feels hard because, we need to, I think today, present hope on some level if we're not to have pure catastrophism and, rightward leaning particularly racist movements occupying the major terrain in public discourse and in electoral politics. So it's a difficult moment that we inhabit, clearly, and I'm sure that the Brexit, we were talking about that just a little bit earlier today, I'm sure it's been on all of your minds, and the difficulty of finding some opposition to dominant neoliberal discourse, which is progressive, is clearly very strong. And I think that's true in the case of urban planning and architecture as well, or at least in what I've gleaned from the research that I've done in this project. I'm very interested in hearing your opinions about these kinds of broader issues.
So that people can hear me. I also deal with this problem as working as a historian, that I enjoy too much the pessimism. And one of the ways I've kind of dealt with that is by taking projects like this and trying to find examples where they also extend into the future, and looking not at how perhaps the ideas that went into the conception of the project have been either successful or not, but looking at the kind of innovations that have taken place and how the projects have been transformed, sometimes transmuted, sometimes appropriated in completely different ways. I don't know if you've looked at these. They're fairly recent, so it's hard to test them in that way. But are there examples of projects that have been conceived under the umbrella of resilience, but which have had some other impact?
Great question. Thank you for that. The project that I'm doing is very kind of contemporary focused, although I suppose if I look at the kind of historical backdrop of some of the places that I touch on, what I do find is that in general, capitalism and forms of urban development and architecture tend to be driven by a pretty short time sort of scale. So New York City's is to be lauded for actually coming up with some kind of a study for resiliency, which projects up to 2050, but it stops at 2050. So there's obviously a huge problem with limiting things there. One of the other examples that I've been looking at in quite a lot of detail is New Orleans, and not the city itself, but the wetlands surrounding New Orleans, which, as I'm sure you all know, are very important buffers to the city because they absorb storms that are coming in off the Gulf and lower the storm surge. But they're disappearing as a result of combination of the reduction of deposition because of the levees put in place over the last 100 years, and because of subsidence of the delta land itself, because of draining of fossil fuels from that land. And so, you know, in so many of the cases that I've been looking at, I'm just struck repeatedly by the short time scale and the inability to project into the future that is now coming back to haunt us. And so I think what I'm trying to do is sound the alarm about that, and to really say that the way in which we think about these concepts is not only too sort of limited in terms of temporality and ethical connection with both future generations and also people of the global south who are coping with climate change today in very real forms, but also by the capitalist system, which is based on unsustainable growth, and by the way that the political process is locked into the capitalist system. So I'm also looking at Miami, you know, and in the Miami State House, you're not allowed to mention climate change. And I went and did ethnography in Miami and surrounding areas in Dade County, and people there are desperate to talk about how they have these plans for resilience and for, you know, coping with climate change into the future. But again, they're all quite limited, and you're not really allowed to talk about retreat at all, right? And for me, that's the major issue which needs to be put on the table, right? Ideas of retreat. So I would say that's where we really need to look to thinking about some forms of planned retreat rather than resiliency, actually. I think resiliency is a way of, in fact, trying to continue to develop and, in most cases, make money for developers, rather than coping with the scale of the calamity which faces coastal cities all over the planet.
Great, thanks for the talk. It was really pessimistic but enjoyable. So when you were describing these projects, sort of a parallel concept that came to mind was Rob Nixon's notion of slow violence. Yeah. And in a way, what you're doing is sort of projecting this into an unbuilt future where slow violence is then getting replicated again. And so for the book, I was wondering if, because I mean, most of us here are potentially historians, theorists, maybe slightly less practitioners. But did you think about trying to seek out practitioners, designers who have this real commitment to environmental justice, who are potentially doing the work that you would, to some extent, adopt ideologically, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I would say certainly the design team behind Hunts Point Lifelines is, you know, trying to do that. And I try to give them credit for the aspects of the project which are really quite progressive, while also suggesting that there's some limitations. So that's the sort of mode that I pursue. And let me take you to the final image. This is in the Jersey coast after Hurricane Sandy. An amusement park which was flooded, which I think is an appropriate image for our times and perhaps for this project as well. Maybe the fun is over, or we see it quickly receding underwater or something like that. But yeah, I did talk to people who are thinking about this quite seriously and ethically. I mentioned Klaus Jakob. I interviewed him. You know, he's based at Columbia University. But again, the political tides are very hard. He was involved with the university as an advisor for their development in Manhattanville and kept trying to push them around these issues of the future of the project with rising sea levels and also around the justice of developing that potentially toxic facility in a neighborhood composed predominantly of people of color. And he said that he, after issuing warning after warning to Columbia, just threw up his hands in disgust and resigned as a way of not being sort of tarred by the project. So, yeah, we're at a moment where more voices, I think, need to be raised that point out to the hypocrisy of current development, which is driven by the need to make money hand over fist, and which is often given a kind of veneer of sustainability through what I would characterize as sort of green capitalist jargon, like the idea of resilience. But it's a difficult thing to tackle. One other person or project that I talk about, which I didn't have time to discuss here, but it's Kate Orff's work. She's also at Columbia and has a very interesting project for putting up sort of oyster shoals off the coast of Staten Island to barricade or maybe that's not the right term, but to shelter the communities that were affected strongly by the storm surge of Hurricane Sandy. And this is obviously an idea which is being developed in other places, including in the Gulf Coast. Once there were huge oyster shoals, actually, which protected the wetlands, which are now disappearing very rapidly. The famous statistic is a football field every hour of Louisiana wetlands disappears into the Gulf. So there's an attempt to sort of bring back oyster shoals. And I think Kate Orff's proposal is one of the most interesting and thoughtful and also sensitive in terms of community engagement. She wants to use that site as a place to engage local schools and children and get them to come to environmental education facilities so they'll be more connected to what's happening on the waterfront and more aware of the dangers of sea level rise. But I guess I ended up sort of being a bit critical of her project because, the news is quite bleak, I'm sorry, but she wants to use oysters. The problem is we're acidifying the oceans, right? And this is not like, 400 years from now the oceans are going to be acidic. Like, oyster industry in the Pacific Northwest is in crisis right now because the oceans are already acidic enough that oysters are not able to survive and build their shells. So, yeah, we're really faced with quite catastrophic times. So again, I kind of come back to the question of how do you report that and be honest about it without just throwing up your hands in despair. Yeah.
Thanks for this really rich talk. I have two questions. The first one is a little bit more basic. You mentioned the 100 Resilient Cities project. It was sponsored by the Rockefellers. I was curious which cities didn't make the cut, if there were any surprises, what the criteria was for that selection. And the second question is, I really appreciated the genealogy that you gave to the keyword resilience, and I wondered if you had done any research on how this term has been translated, both on the level of language into different languages, if it carries different connotations, if it carries a similar sense of hope and yet fear of catastrophe, but also into different cultural contexts. Is there a German word for resilience? Is there a Chinese term for resilience? If your research has taken you in that direction.
I'm afraid I have to answer both of those questions by saying I don't really know. I didn't look at which cities didn't make the cut. I mean, it's a fascinating question. I think would open interesting research avenues for the role of sort of tourism and the place of cities in a kind of global hierarchy of economic development, which of course was key to the whole global city discourse in the first place, right? With the idea that only certain cities get to be global hubs, global cities, and the others are all sort of not making the grade. They're not performing the same way. So the global cities discourse reinscribes forms of hierarchical developmentalism, which were part of developmentalist logic, and prior to that, of course, of colonial discourse about cities, right, where the idea was native people, the colonized, weren't actually urban, right? And then once cities were within the developmentalist rubric, they were seen as behind, not developed enough. They needed to have, the forms of knowledge that Western cities had developed and the forms of infrastructure brought to them. So I think that, it would be really interesting to look at, because I suspect many of those same dynamics would be reiterated. But I have to say that I haven't actually done that yet. As far as the translation of resilience into other languages, oh my God. I mean, it's what I've been looking at is the way it travels from one discourse to another in English. So in the book, I have a chapter on, I'm calling it climate apartheid, sort of on ways in which the figure of the environmental refugee gets used by in contemporary humanitarian discourse and by world leaders to sort of say, we're going to have millions of refugees on our doorstep unless we cut emissions, right? So it gets used in forums like the Conference of Parties, where they're trying to negotiate emissions reductions. But it's also really central to military discourse. So I look at this crazy book by this guy, David Kilcullen, who is a military consultant who is arguing that the big megatrends of this century are going to be population increase, environmental disaster, and coastal urbanization. And so we need to have military capacity for going in and fighting in those contexts to make sure that we deal with the terrorist threats. And we need to have a resilient military force that can survive in those difficult contexts. So I think I didn't get to other languages because it seemed like as a discourse it just was so polysemic, even in English, and translated to so many different areas that was enough for me. But it's a fascinating question, and it's certainly worth researching.
Sure. Well, I think that's very interesting. Maybe discourse versus discourses, whether, let's say, economy, ecology, so on and so forth, are all kind of part of one discourse, and how, what the reach of it is, what the historical extent of it is, might be important in a way. I'm most curious about what the alternatives are to the discourse. It seems like there's a way where, as soon as you start talking ecologically, your kind of balance comes into the equation, or resilience comes in through the back door, and then you can't sort of shake it, right? This would be like saying, like, what is the other language of talking about these issues? You talked about retreat, which seems interestingly, completely other to that, right? But is there like a whole kind of discourse that retreat would fit into that would be a kind of compelling alternative?
Wow. I haven't thought that through yet. I think that the discourse that retreat would fit into would be one that I'm thinking of calling disaster communism, right? It seems to me that the left is kind of, to a certain extent, hamstrung at the moment by a similar perspective as the resilience perspective, right? We found that centralized planning doesn't work. And so, although even that's debatable, right? The Soviet Union gave Western capitalist, liberal colonial democracies quite a run for their money. But nonetheless, there's this common perception that centralized planning doesn't work on the left. And so the major way of organizing seems to be through ideas of emergence, ideas of horizontalism and self-organization. And that's another one of the things that I look at in the book. I look at Occupy Sandy, where people sort of went into disaster-affected communities and tried to do these forms of organizing with the communities. And they were extraordinarily effective, right? In the first weeks after Hurricane Sandy, Occupy Sandy managed to become a hub for collecting and distributing huge amounts of food and medicines and other things to disaster-affected communities, to the point where, FEMA and the Red Cross, they just weren't present in a lot of those communities. Places like in the Rockaways, where there are these post-World War II projects where the elevators went out and the boilers ceased functioning. So you had, poor communities, elderly people often, who not only couldn't get down the stairs to get their medicines, but couldn't get water, right? Because water in New York City only goes up to the 5th floor without power. So, Sandy really brought home the vulnerability of urban communities in the most direct way. So Occupy Sandy did an amazing job of organizing and providing the kind of social infrastructure which you really need in a disaster. But what I found from interviewing people who'd been involved in Occupy Sandy was that that capacity only went so far, right? And particularly as the stage of kind of coping with the disaster began to diminish and the project of rebuilding began to take off, right? So in other words, when a housing project whose boiler room had been flooded, they needed a new boiler. Occupy Sandy didn't have the logistical resources to get a new boiler and install it, right? So that's where, the state came in. So Occupy Sandy activists found that they didn't have the resources they needed, and also that the state had become somewhat parasitical on them, right? So that FEMA and the National Guard and other groups were actually coming to Occupy Sandy hubs and sort of saying, well, so how do we do this? And in many cases, allowing Occupy Sandy either to do the work for them or else draining their knowledge and of local social infrastructures. So what I think I conclude both from that particular experience as well as from looking at the kind of longer term, to go back to the idea of slow violence, the kind of slow way that this disaster, the kind of catastrophic conjunction, which, I'm calling my book Extreme City because, I think we're faced with this conjunction of extreme weather events and then of urbanization in coastal areas predominantly, and it's a form of urbanization which is polarized in economic and social terms, right? So it's extreme on multiple different levels. The way that we need to think about confronting this conflict, I think, is through, the states and through a struggle to transform the state and make it more answerable. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like because states are under tremendous pressure and are breaking down. And as major global cities, see portions flooded and becoming uninhabitable potentially in the relatively near future. By the end of the century, certainly, if we listen to James Hansen's projections about sea level rise, there's going to be a lot of strain on existing states. But the alternative to having a planned and democratic and radical kind of transition, including a planned and radical retreat and maybe building of new cities in other places, is to have a chaotic one where the forces of darkness who are thinking very seriously about this. That's what my research on securitization and the military suggests. The military is planning for all of this stuff, and they're the ones running the kind of scenarios of what's going to happen in a way that none of the politicians in our cities are talking about. So if we're not going to let them handle it, then we need another plan. And I just don't really see that on the table at the moment. So that's sort of what I'm advocating for, and I'm calling it disaster communism, just to irritate people.
My question or comment dovetails with the retreat discussion. And I know you sort of offered this arc of response as being really from aid to prevention to what you propose as retreat. But I guess I want to challenge a little bit that idea of retreat, or maybe have you outline it a little bit more distinctly for us. Because I think for, I guess, my experience in the coastal town of Connecticut that I live in, this idea of retreat is actually happening, but that it reinforces those social justice issues because particularly retreat happens or is happening for those who can afford.
Right.
And retreat for those who can't are those people, fifth generation in, rundown houses who cannot afford to sort of exit the real estate and land that they've invested in. So I guess my question for retreat is, what does that mean?
Right.
How do you outline it? How do we do it properly and with justice, because it feels like it just might reinforce those trajectories reinforced by capitalism again. So how can we not be skeptical and negative again with this retreat?
I mean, I think you put your finger on it. That's the danger, right? Unless we start talking about these issues, the danger is that the people who have the money will just cut out. And that's definitely already happening, whether it's retreat in actual terms of fleeing from coastlines, which I suspect is going to happen more and more. I mean, people with money may be sinking it into real estate in places like Miami, but that's because they've got a very short timeline for realizing profits. They're not taking out 30-year mortgages like the average Joe Schmo is doing and thinking about what's going to happen in 30 years. So yeah, it's a huge problem. And so I'm kind of arguing that we need to put it on the table as an issue and begin talking about it. The problem is that, at least in the United States, any idea of retreat is inimical to the kind of imperial masculinity that is so prevalent in American public discourse, right? So if you're from the US or you've been paying attention since 9/11 to what circulates in the public sphere, there's this kind of bumper sticker of these colors don't run, right? The kind of idea that, American flag and American people will stand up, and that whole idea is, when we are hit by a disaster, we'll just build it back again stronger than ever before, right? And that's the kind of FEMA model, right? So this kind of discourse of imperial masculinity, which we see in Hollywood movies, then translates into disaster, how to deal with disasters, and also into ideas about how to fund retreat. But this is something that people are pushing for. Two examples very quickly. So one is after Hurricane Sandy, some communities in Staten Island organized to push for a kind of planned community retreat. There were, I think, about 10 communities that were pushing for that, if I recall correctly, and only 2 of them got state funding. So, and the New York State post-Sandy program was called Build It Back. So there wasn't much space for ideas of people wanting to move away from the shoreline. And of course, there's a whole history behind the development of those areas that were flooded. They were originally in tidal wetlands, and the state developed them for industrial uses, and then when the industries didn't come, they moved communities of color there, and yada, yada, yada. So there was a big push for that, and it was pretty much squelched, but a few communities got it. And the other really interesting development, I don't know if you've heard about this, but just recently, HUD, as part of its big sort of disaster resilience competition, which just wound down, gave $50 million to a group of Native Americans who live in the Mississippi Delta south of New Orleans. And the grant is to move the entire community and to regather members of the community who left, because as you sort of say, people have been moving out of these kinds of communities for quite some time. I mean, retreat is already happening. It's not really part of public discourse. So the grant was to support the movement of the community away and the preservation of its cultural values. And so that's a very important precedent, particularly if we compare what's happening there with what's happening to indigenous communities in Alaska, where there's absolutely nothing being done to help people move away from threatened shorelines. So, yeah, I mean, we face a very difficult situation where there's a real danger of injustices being perpetuated. But I mean, we need to really talk about these issues and get them into public discourse, I think.
On? Hi.
There you go.
I was just curious about whether or not resilience was a term that had been reappropriated or appropriated at all by activists or some of the community groups that you've been looking at, or if that's something that's only part of a dominant discourse.
No, I think it sort of floats around and gets used by people, and I can see why it's an attractive idea to particularly activists with Occupy Sandy. And there's something to be said about the kind of class and ethnic composition of the Occupy movement, and particularly Occupy Sandy there, and the ways in which kind of self-help and autonomous organizing appeal to a certain demographic. But I mean, I think the ideas of resilience do quite resonate in contemporary communities and radical activist circles, particularly anarchist ones. So I think it's very much prominent there as well. So yeah. Ideas of emergence, you know, all the sorts of related constellation of concepts are quite attractive for a whole variety of reasons to people on the left. And so part of what I'm trying to do in the project is kind of sound the alarm about the danger of using that discourse without being aware of the way it's used in much more kind of official and even potentially, you know, very unsettling areas like the military-industrial complex in the US.
Thanks. I was really interested on a methodological level in your toggling between perhaps like a presentist point of view and a historical point of view. So we have on one side field work and case studies and interviews, which would be the presentist, and then of course the historical genealogy. So I wonder like how you conceptualize the relationship between these two methodologies and how you perhaps reconcile them or juxtapose them, and then ultimately like to what ends or to what effects.
That's a great question, because I don't think I have an answer. I thought it through. I mean, I wanted to do a presentation which gave you an interesting keyword and then some case studies to wrap your heads around, just to be somewhat entertaining. But no, I mean, seriously, I think that the idea was to see how something that is having so much impact in the present, you know, and as I tried to point out in some sort of detail, the Rockefeller Foundation competition was very much oriented around the idea of resilience. And so I think the idea was by giving a kind of history of the term the way that Raymond Williams did for words like nature or civilization, you can sort of see why the term might be used problematically, right? So my idea was to show how, okay, this term in environmental discourses seems very attractive, right? It doesn't have some of the problematic aspects that sustainability does, right? And sustainability, as I'm sure you know, has been kind of hegemonic since the Brundtland report in the late 1980s. Made it part of environmental discourse and policy discourse internationally. It's the main kind of rubric for organizing Rio and subsequent Conference of Parties discourses and meetings. And I would say that kind of resiliency is beginning to displace the idea of sustainability, and it reflects the kind of glimmering recognition that if sustainability was premised on the idea of ecosystems being static, right? And the idea is you have a static ecosystem and then there's an interruption and you should just get back to that static state. Well, that's clearly not where we are, right? We're in a system where we've got all of these feedback effects. And even if those feedback effects are still not acknowledged enough, right? So the penultimate IPCC report didn't take into consideration in terms of its projections for sea level rise the impact of ice melt in Greenland and Antarctica. Why? Because scientists weren't completely sure about the rate of melt and, you know, the physical dynamics of the melting of the ice sheets there. And so scientists are quite conservative, and so they tend not to say things that they aren't 100% sure about. So the IPCC just left out that contribution to sea level rise. And that's one of the reasons that James Hansen has issued these new predictions for sea level rise, right? He's taking into account feedback effects, you know, as the oceans warm up and the ice sheets melt, there are going to be various feedback effects which speed the melting. So we are realizing that we increasingly live in a state that is not equilibrium, that's not sustainable, that's, you know, and so resilience seems like an attractive idea. But ultimately, often it just becomes the same thing, right? Even though it's very complicated and you can do a lot of intellectual sort of stuff about self-organizing systems and systems that go through various phase transitions, the way it gets used in engineering is often you just want to build a system which when something hits it, it ends up being able to weather that shock and go back to the way it was. And I think in architecture, it often sort of gets used similarly. Although I think a lot of architects are more savvy about the kind of genealogy that I traced and about the environmental links that resiliency has, or the links that it has to environmental discourse. It often just ends up being sort of used to say, we're going to just keep doing the same thing, actually. And as I hope you've gleaned, I don't think that that's viable.
So thanks for the talk. So just to go off again off the resilience thing for the 100th time. So if you're looking at, it's more of a comment than a question, but if you're looking at the genealogy of resilience, I'm wondering whether it would be fruitful to look at sort of the genealogy of the system of capitalism and map it onto that, because we're going to read Chakrabarty for not your talk, but another day.
Yeah.
But she sort of talks about how, you know, we can't assume the capitalist system as having sort of had the static status in history. And so if you're looking at the genealogy of one system, might it be fruitful to look at sort of the genealogy of the capitalist system and see how it maps on, not assume, if, you know, depending on how far you want to go back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because this is assuming a neoliberal model and that's all good, but, you know, like what about prior to that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So.
No, that's a fascinating idea, and I'm sure it would be very productive. And it would be interesting to, you know, go through Hayek more closely, because sort of that was his project in some ways, right? To sort of think about capitalism in relation to these ecosystem models. Although he also, as I said, he's all over the place and goes into neurology, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, my main concern with that is that it might inadvertently dovetail with the naturalization of capitalism, you know, with ways of seeing capitalism as a system which is kind of, you know, built to function in a certain way and works autonomously by itself according to certain natural laws. And I don't want to do that for sure. You know, I want to try and be critical of that and say that this is about, you know, capital accumulation and decisions by the global 1% that are fundamentally unethical and are destructive of environmental systems around the planet as well as of people's lives. So that's why I think I you know, skew away from that. But thank you. It's an interesting idea, and I should definitely, you know, look through Hayek and the way he talks about this stuff in more detail. I read his Nobel Prize talk in quite a lot of detail, but there's certainly a lot more to be done about that. And I think people use emergence and resilience ideas today without really being aware of the fact that Hayek was the one who used them so much. Melinda Cooper has a great book called Life as Surplus. I don't know if folks have run into that book, but it's a really fascinating discussion of the ways in which sort of environmental terms get used. And she talks a little bit about resilience, particularly about the Santa Fe Institute, which in the 1980s became an important site where biologists and economists would gather and sort of come up with these theories. And they talked about just sort of, you know, shocking ideas, right? I mean, the kind of idea that, well, capitalism has these cycles and it crashes every now and then, but that's okay, because when it crashes, you know, it just gets going again, and then it has more growth as a result. And the ecosystem is kind of like that too. We're going through a mass extinction event. That's okay. You know, we'll have eventually, after what, you know, billions of years, new life forms evolving, right? So, you know, people talking about mass extinction, of course, of human beings, but also of other life forms on the planet, and sort of saying, yeah, this is great. This is the way we want things to go. So yeah, there's interesting work to be done there, for sure.
Other questions? I wonder whether you can briefly talk about your larger project, since you've worked on environmental issues with your previous publications. I'm curious how you select your cases and the specific angles. I mean, your book on Extinction is tackling this challenge of like not climate change, but the Anthropocene differently in re-narrating as a strategy history of civilization through the extinction of species. And on the other hand, you now moved scales to the urban.
Right.
And I wonder what caused that like shift in perspective, and where did you end up now, like with the urban scale?
I've been thinking about cities for a long time. Back in, what is it, 2004, I think, I edited a special issue of Social Text on cities of the Global South. And I think it had to do with the recognition. I come from post-colonial studies originally. It's my field. I studied with Edward Said, if that helps you place me. And so in thinking about post-colonial societies and post-colonial discourse and theories of revolution, most of them had to do with theories of the rural, right? Think about Maoism, for instance, or Che Guevara's Foucault theory, the sort of idea that, or even Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, the idea that the real center of consciousness of the people was in the peasantry and in rural areas, and that's where transformation would come from. And so I guess I became aware through reading that urbanization was happening on a massive scale in the Global South. And this was before Mike Davis published Planet of Slums. But, of course, and actually he contributed to that special issue of Social Text that I co-edited. Once he published Planet of Slums, which has many problems, but it's a brilliant book for, really anatomizing this dynamic of one of the most significant transformations in the history of humanity is, urbanization of people in the Global South into informal settlements. It just seemed to me that post-colonial theorists should be thinking about this and about what the potential for transformation, as well as some of the critical dynamics facing people in those places was. And then in conjunction with that, I also got involved in environmental issues. As you mentioned, Kim, I was working on the climate justice movement. I was really lucky to go to Cochabamba in 2010 for the World People's Conference. It was called the World People's Conference on Climate Justice and the Rights of Mother Nature, very long title. But I went with a delegation of environmental justice activists from New York, and they're also, as part of sort of the gathering of delegations from the global north, the Bolivian authorities also brought indigenous activists, many of them from Canada, in fact, folks working against the tar sands projects. And their idea was to connect people in the global south and people in the global north around climate justice and environmental justice issues. And so it really seemed to me that these two sets of issues came together, that the city and environmental struggles had to be seen as absolutely crucial for the future of the great majority of humanity. And this was antithetical to post-colonial studies, as I mentioned, but it's also kind of runs counter to a lot of other discourses, right, where environment and city are seen as two totally separate things, right? Nature happens out there, and cities are not supposed to be environmental places. And being at the Graduate Center, I was around folks like David Harvey and particularly Neil Smith, who were thinking in very different terms. So that's where this work came from. So yeah, it's been a long time gestating, and I'm very happy to finally be winding the project up almost, although I'm behind deadline for getting it to the publisher. Any
further questions? No? Thank you.
You can. Thank you. Thank you all.
We'll meet tomorrow at 10 o'clock next door for the discussion of Mike Davis' text to build the arc.
Okay, fantastic. Looking forward to seeing you all then.